The broadcast is now starting.
Hello everyone, happy Thursday, happy post-eclipse week, happy to see you all survived that and are here with us today for the next episode of the PixelMill Webinar Series and today's offering of TypeScript and the SharePoint Framework Better Together. As usual, my name is Michael Wells. I am your neighborhood-friendly partnerships and community manager here at PixelMill, and it is my pleasure to welcome those back who have joined us before, or if you haven't joined us before and this is your first time, welcome. A little bit about PixelMill really quick. We are a SharePoint digital design agency, based out of Davis, California. What we're looking to do is help our clients build really cool custom portals that focus on the user experience and really help drive user adoption. That's what we're shooting to do. There's a little bit about us. That's about it. Quick couple usual webinar things. If you've been on a webinar before, you're used to hearing. If you have any questions at any time during the webinar, there should be a questions tab for you to put your questions in there. I'll be keeping track of those throughout the webinar. I'll try to sneak them in there as I can as our speaker is going through his session. If for some reason we don't get to these during the session, there is a Q&A part at the end of this, about 15 minutes is what we try to do. And if we don't get to those, we'll try to follow them up in our usual post webinar blog. That's about it for now. Without further ado, let me present to you our speaker, hailing all the way from Utah, Mr. Ryan Schouten. Take it away.
Thank you, Michael. All right, so we're going to have some fun today talking about TypeScript and SharePoint. So a little bit of housekeeping on my end. A little about me. My name is Ryan Schouten, as was introduced. I am based out of Utah. I'm the Utah SharePoint User Group President, been working with SharePoint, primarily developing on SharePoint for over 10 years now. Before that, I was an ASP.NET developer, and then which made the transition into SharePoint development pretty easy. So it's one of those things I tell people. Over the years, I had SharePoint forced on me because I was the web team lead, and the company said, hey, we're doing SharePoint. Figure it out. So I did, and loved it ever since. So made it really nice for development. Now, one of the things we're going to be talking about today, we're talking about the SharePoint framework. So if you've attended the previous webinars that PixelMill has done, we've covered very heavily the SharePoint framework and everything that it takes to get started on working with them. And I know Eric has done some really cool stuff. What we're going to be talking about today is we're going to be talking about an integral part of the SharePoint framework that a lot of people don't realize is that they're actually using, and that is TypeScript. The default, and unless you're manually creating your own project by hand, you are already using TypeScript, and you've already seen TypeScript in your projects if you've done any SharePoint framework development. So the purpose of this webinar is to help you have a familiarity with what TypeScript is, what it changes, what do we have with when it comes to what's the changes with JavaScript development, because this is kind of a different animal. So we're going to be talking about that today. So a little bit, first thing we got, okay, what is TypeScript? High level, TypeScript is a JavaScript transpiler. Okay, now transpile is not a full compile. Really what we're dealing with is TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript. So we're not taking anything away from JavaScript. For the most part, the majority of your JavaScript code, if you've written anything already, will just carry over and work in TypeScript. So we're not losing a whole lot there. But we do add in some cool things. We add in some typing, as its name implies. So that way we have some type checks. If I declare a variable and say, hey, this is a string, TypeScript is going to warn me if I try putting any other data type in there that it really shouldn't be in there. So we get some nice checking going along. Also, TypeScript is awesome if you're coming from a server-side development realm, be it if you're a C# developer, you're a Java developer, and some of these other languages. If you've done any of those full object-oriented languages, a lot of the concepts and constructs that we're going to be talking about for TypeScript are the same. We get to use those, but in JavaScript development. So we have all those concepts in there. So some of the new things that we have to deal with, some of the new things that are added in on top of our regular JavaScript is as we mentioned earlier, we have types. And the next cool thing we've got is enumerations. And we'll talk about all of these in detail in just a moment. We have classes, interfaces, modules, and then there's some changes to how functions are set up. So for as far as adding types to TypeScript, Actually, let me step back one moment. One of the cool things also about TypeScript that many people may not realize is that TypeScript is created and backed and run by Microsoft itself. So this is not something that some little company set up a year ago and that could be here today and gone tomorrow. TypeScript has been around for many years. I've started playing with it about, how long has it been? About 3 or 4 years ago. And so it's gone on, it's progressed, but most of the basics are still there. So that being said, the cool things is we can add type information to our variables. We can say, hey, this is a string, this is a number, this is a Boolean variable, this is our custom object. Now, it's not required. By default in TypeScript, if you don't give a type to a variable, it's going to assume it's of type any, which is just standard object. Anything can go in there. It's not going to do any checks on there for you. If you do specify it, or if you assign a value to it when you declare that variable, TypeScript's going to figure out what that type is. So if you say, in our example here, we have var variable : string. If we took out the : string and just said, okay, var variable equals string hello world, TypeScript is smart enough to know that we have assigned a string to it, so we're implicitly defining this as a string variable. So then all the type checks and everything go into play, and life is good. Now, beyond that, if you've dealt with server-side development before, enumerations are nothing new. If you've been doing JavaScript, it's kind of a tricky concept to try and get it to work. We can do some of the stuff, but with TypeScript, we have the ability to set up an enumeration, which gives us a friendly name to be able to work with different values. That way we can say, okay, in our code, we want to use this name. So we want to use the types of animals as a dog, or as a cat, as a bird, whatever it is. In our code, we just have to reference that, and then we don't have to worry about how it's managed in the back end, and we have a friendlier name and say, okay, this is option 1. What is it? So we have our example here, Butch, we're saying is an animal, which, as you may notice, we're saying that's how we also declare a type. So the type safety that's in there, TypeScript is also going to enforce and say, okay, I know what Butch is. So if you're trying to tell me, hey, this is what Butch is, and if it's not in the enumeration that we've defined, it's going to complain and say, hey, nope, sorry, you're not allowed. But then we're immediately assigning it saying, hey, Butch is a dog. Fairly simple. Now, classes. This is one of those constructs that really makes it easier to compartmentalize and create reusable code. Now, one of the things that's really a lot of people like as a power of JavaScript is the fact that everything's kind of loosey-goosey. You can do things whatever you want. You can create your classes. You can create functions in your code outside of classes, and you can just load on a page and everything's happy. Well, in TypeScript, since it is JavaScript, we can still do that, but classes give us a way to compartmentalize and get a lot of the enforcement of different accessibility on our data to how to make our code more secure and more reliable and easier to maintain. So the nice part is with TypeScript as well, we get public and private. And one other thing I don't listen, that you probably should list there as well, we also can do static as well. So we can declare a variable and we can say, okay, whether it's public, private, or static, meaning it's available to any instance of that class. We also get constructors, so we can initialize our code and our object and set up basic piece of information. So if we pass in, okay, I need this, here's the information we're starting out with, we can pre-fill and say, okay, well, this is a new object, we're not getting an existing one, so we're going to set some default values to some of our properties. Also, we can inherit. So if we go back to the example of animal, we can have an animal parent class, and then we can have children that is a dog or a cat that has specific properties that are more relevant to those objects. So if you've dealt with SharePoint for a few years, the same way we can do inheritance with content types, we can do the same thing with classes in TypeScript. Also, we have some standard options for, as we mentioned, static properties, and then get and set variables for updating or doing the properties for updating the values out of our class. Now, this is all well and good, but what does this look like? So it's as simple as just defining, hey, I want to create a class, and we're going to call it greeter. And we have some basic information here. We're creating a property on here that is called greeting. It's a type string. We have a constructor where we can receive in the message. And then we have a function on here that is, we'll just essentially do our hello world, which will give back the greeting value that we specified. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is in JavaScript at the moment is kind of going through a big shift. For years, JavaScript has not changed a whole lot. More recently, JavaScript has seen a revival in its use, thanks in large part to a lot of these client-side frameworks and Node.js and all that stuff. All these things are starting to take in some of these concepts. So for years we've had, and you may hear referenced, ECMAScript 5 or ECMAScript 6, or now they've got some different names where they're actually calling it ECMAScript 2016 or 2015. They have a bunch of different names for it. But the old stuff that all the browsers support right now is ECMAScript 5 or ES5. Now, going forward, ES6 and beyond, all these new names for things, they're including a lot of concepts. So like this class variable works in an ES6 class in JavaScript file that we're creating. So we have some of the same concepts. Now, with TypeScript, because it is a transpile language, we can define as part of our configuration which version of JavaScript we want this transpiled down to. So if we are working on a system where we need to support some older browsers, say we have to do IE 8 or 9, whatever the case is, and support those, or even just Internet Explorer 11 for the most part, we have to stick with ES5. But if we're in an environment where we know that the user base is 100% using Chrome or Firefox that supports these newer versions of JavaScript, we can just compile it down to there, and then the transpilation isn't as involved because it can natively support a lot of these objects and concepts. Now, another cool thing that you may have seen if you've dealt with the SharePoint framework at all are interfaces. Really, an interface is nothing more than just a contract. It's how we define to our code, this is what we're going to be doing with it. That we have to say, okay, if you're going to be of this type, so you're being an interface for this, the contract states that you have to have these properties and methods that are as part of you. Otherwise, you're not allowed to say, yes, I am, for example, a dog. If you're an animal, you have to be able to say, okay, you have to have a type and a name or whatever we want to define. So if I say, okay, I'm a dog, but I don't have a name, TypeScript's going to complain and say, no, you're not. You haven't met the contract, so you cannot call yourself that. But there are also options as a developer when we're setting up our code. We can define certain properties and methods as optional. Say, okay, you have to have these ones. These ones are nice if they've got it, but it's not necessarily required. If they don't have it, we'll still deal with it. We'll give you a default value or something, and we'll carry on. Then life is still good. So what does that look like? It's just as easy as saying interface and then give it a name. So in here, it kind of looks very similar to what we had before with a class, in that we say instead of class, we say interface, we give it a name, and then we just define it. Now, to use it, TypeScript treats an interface just the same way as it would a type or a class. So if we want to say that it has to be of a specific interface, we just list it out as if we would if it was a class for us. So the nice part is with that, for example, our labeled value interface, in our function, since we are specifying that this is a labeled value interface, that's what we're getting passed in as our parameter, we know with fairly good certainty that what's getting sent to us will always have a property called label. So in our print, we can log, and we know we're going to have a label value on there. If it doesn't, TypeScript is going to complain. Now, we have to keep in mind, though, TypeScript does a lot of good checks for us when we're dealing with and we're writing our code. If we are passing in data that does not match the type checks, since JavaScript itself does not support type checks, our code, if bad data gets passed into it, is going to have problems. So if we're pulling in a data from an external source, say we're doing a REST API call out to SharePoint, if we're saying, hey, this has to have this value, and it doesn't, there's no check that's going to happen at that point in time. So we're just going to have to deal with it. And so there are some ways that this just kind of helps more for development, making our lives easier. When it comes down to it, we still have to do type checks and making sure information is in the format that we're expecting it to be. Otherwise, our code's going to crash on us. Now, one of the things we've got is it's a concept that we can do with in JavaScript where we can create different namespaces. So if you've dealt with server-side code, a module gives us a way of compartmentalizing and packaging up a group of code. So that way everything is contained in a certain set. So we can pull in, put all of our code in here, but since it's inside a module, anything that we want to be available outside of our module, we have to make sure we export it. If we don't export it, it's not available, it's strictly internal, nobody else can access it. Also, we can do splitting of our modules across different files. So we can have a certain portion of our module in file A, and then in file B, we could have a completely different piece of functionality, but they're all part of the same module, same set of code. Also, we can alias them and give them different names just to make it a little easier. So what does that look like? And apologize, this is a little on the small side, is really we have our same stuff, we have interfaces, but what we are defining is we are defining, right now we have a non-modular interface. So it's kind of why it's small. I need enough room for both of them. So if we wanted to declare this as a module, all we have to do is we say, okay, just like with our interfaces and our classes, we say, this is a module, give it a name. So as you can see in this reference here, we have some variables we're storing for regular expressions, just to make sure that the data we're putting in here for our validation matches. If it doesn't match, we can deal with it. And then we're exporting an interface and a couple classes that we can deal with to interact and perform our validations. The nice part is nobody outside of our module has access to our regular expressions. So they can't go in, they can't see them, they can't change them. So a nice way of compartmentalizing and making sure that our code stays our code. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, but in a lot of the examples we've been showing, functions are a little different than what you're used to seeing if you've done JavaScript development before. In standard JavaScript, if you need to declare a function, we need to say, okay, function, give it a name, parentheses. In TypeScript, that's no longer a requirement. TypeScript is smart enough to know that, okay, if we're defining something and we're putting the parentheses and then the curly braces for its body, it knows that it is a function. Also, because this is TypeScript, functions can have a specified return type. So we can say our function will always return a string or will always return a Boolean value. So that way we know when our type checks can say, hey, do the data types match, and we have our IntelliSense and all those sort of things with it. Now, if in TypeScript we can do optional parameters, if we do not specify that a parameter is optional, it's going to assume it's a required value. So we have to, since we're dealing with JavaScript, all of our code gets transpiled back down to JavaScript. We still have a lot of the same limitations. So the number of parameters of a function have to match. So if we're defining, we can do some different functions that have different names, do some inheritance type things, have the same name, but it all comes down back to JavaScript, so we're kind of limited on what we can do. But we can mark parameters as optional. And then TypeScript handles the JavaScript generation to handle all those cool things that we get to deal with. Also, we can give it a default value. So if we say, hey, if they don't pass in a value, instead of assuming this is null or undefined, I want you to use this as your default value. It makes it a little easier to force a check. Now, keep in mind, if we're doing optional parameters or ones with a default value, they have to become after required parameters. Thank you, JavaScript. Just due to the way that JavaScript handles its parameter passing from functions, we're kind of stuck with that. Now, why would I want to spend the time and effort for producing and switching over to learning TypeScript? What's in it for me? Now, a lot of times I see there's been a lot of developers I've met as I've gone out and talked about TypeScript and development in SharePoint over the years. There's a lot of developers that haven't quite caught on to the vision of what TypeScript is. They like the flexibility and the loosey-goosiness of JavaScript, which has its power. It's got some really cool things it can do. If you're dealing in an environment where you need to reliably produce code that can be checked and make sure you're going to be eliminating 90% of your bugs before you release them, TypeScript is just awesome. And one of the ways it does that is it has compile time validation, and not necessarily full compile, what I mean transpile time validation. Also, with the modern editors, that validation also comes across into our editors. So we don't have to wait until we compile. We have the feedback, and we'll look at some of the stuff in the demos. Also, the code is much easier to understand. And if you've ever looked at trying to create some of these concepts for doing JavaScript development, if you wanted to create a class, there are at least 3 different methods of doing it. That you can do a self-executing function, you can do the revealing pattern. It has all these different ways of creating a class, but it really just looks ugly. And so it's not that really easy to figure out. TypeScript, it's a lot easier. Also, for Visual Studio 2015 and beyond, so we're a couple versions of Visual Studio beyond that point in time, TypeScript is built in. So full Visual Studio knows how to interact and deal with and handle TypeScript files. So if you say in your project you want to add in a TypeScript file, it'll handle it. Everything's good, no complaints. If you have some of the older versions, there's an add-in you can go download from the TypeScript site, and then it'll know how to process it, and things are still good. Also, if you're dealing with Visual Studio Code, it has support built in for understanding TypeScript and dealing with it. Now, some of the things that could cause you some headaches, because we are dealing with typed entities. If you're pulling in a custom library, it's something that's code that you've not produced, a lot of the times if you're pulling in packages, since we're doing SharePoint Framework development, if you're pulling in packages from NPM, so you're pulling in node modules, and say, okay, I'm going to include this in my project, a lot of those, they understand that, hey, this is going to be consumed by people that may use TypeScript, so they make sure they have the definitions for our files. So those will come in a .d.ts file. If they are not available, so if it doesn't come with it, say for example, you're manually including a reference to jQuery, we need to go reference that. So we have an example down here. In our TypeScript file, we can just do a // and then less than reference path equals, and we give it the path to our .d.ts files. This is what tells TypeScript, okay, this is where you go get your type definition so it can deal with things. Otherwise, it's going to look at it and say, okay, well, I don't know what this is. I'm going to treat it as any. And so we have no validations. We have no checks. It's just kind of sitting there, which we can do if we want to be lazy. Also, we are going to be writing our code in .ts files. And then those will be transpiled to create .js files. So as we're working through things, the browser itself does not know what a TS file is or how to deal with it. But as part of the transpilation, when we are debugging, it creates a map to tie between our TS file and our JS file. So when we get into debugging our code, we're actually going to be getting in and dealing with and interacting with our TS files, with our code. So we don't have to try and figure out, okay, well, now this is how it's transpiled to JavaScript, and then we've got to deal with it. So this makes it really nice with the tools we have available to us, especially with the SharePoint Framework. All of the TypeScript transpilation, all those sort of things, the generation of all of our JavaScript files and our d.ts files and the maps and all that is handled for us. We just get to take advantage of all the awesomeness that is TypeScript without all the headaches of having to figure out how to get this set up. All right, now let's go take a look and see how we deal with this. So if we carry on, we'll go ahead and stop this guy, and I'm going to bring a window over here real quick. Okay, if you want to go see and figure out more information about TypeScript, it's just as easy as going to TypeScript lang.org. And from here, you can they have downloads for if you need an older support for an older version of Visual Studio. There's documentation. There's a whole lot of information about what we have here. Now, I was mentioning this to a group when I was in Seattle a couple weeks ago, that this city skyline looks a little familiar. And so for those that don't know, we have a nice Space Needle here, and I forget what they call this wheel that's sitting on the waterfront down in Seattle. And a large part of that is, as I said, if we scroll to the bottom of the page here, we have a nice recognizable logo that I'm sure we've all seen before. So, like I said, this is a Microsoft-backed product, so we're not worried about going anywhere. Now, the cool thing we've got here is we have documentation. So if you're getting into this, you want to figure this out, you want to know how to play with it, I would definitely suggest you spend some time looking at the documentation. And primarily, if you go out and expand the handbook, this is going to give you examples of how to set everything up and all the different types. So as we can see, we talked about before, we have types, we have interfaces, classes, enumerations, all these other different options. We have everything that makes up TypeScript in there. So we can click on one of those, we have examples, and we say, oh, okay, if I want to learn how to do a specific concept, it's all here. Now, the other cool thing that we can do with this website is they've included a playground. So inside the playground, we can play and deal with some of the examples of, okay, how does this transpilation really look? What options do we get here? So as you can see in here, we have our greeter example. And I'll admit, I shamelessly pulled this from when I generated this content a while back. So we have the same greeter concept. We have our class for a greeter. Now, if we look at this code, the TypeScript side, it looks fairly simple. Okay, we have our class greeter, and we have the same stuff we had before, and then we're going to use it. So we're going to say, okay, we're creating a greeter. We're saying greeter, the message we want to output is world, and so we say, okay, when they click the button, we'll output and we'll do an alert that says greeter.greet, which will throw in our hello world. So if we look at it, this code takes up 19 lines. When we make any changes to here, it'll, on the right-hand side, it'll be transpiled in the browser, pretty cool, into JavaScript. And in reality, it's down to 16 lines. But if we take out, we also have 1, 2, 3 lines of white space in ours. So for the most part, if we're doing a basic example like this, JavaScript versus TypeScript, it's about a 1-for-1 when it comes to how many lines of code are actually being generated by this. So we can come in here and I can say, you know what? We'll say, I want to change this message to, oops, if I can type, webinar attendees. As you see on the right, it's automatically adjusted, and it says the same thing that we adjusted on our left-hand side. Now, if we change the drop-down here, we can use some more advanced concepts. So, for example, if we want to say use inheritance, over here we're creating an animal class, and we have a snake and a horse, and we're just creating some information about it. We're creating some objects saying that they both, since they are animals, they move. Since it's not a rock, we have the information there. So we're defining for this class, this is what they have to do. And so we're saying our snake is an animal. So it says, okay, it's constructor. We can use the super, so we're calling its parents constructor, passing in that information, and then we come down and we're defining when it moves, how it actually moves. And then the horse, we have the same kind of setup. Now, what we have here, though, is on our left-hand side with white space, we have 28 lines of TypeScript. If we want to do that same type of inheritance and all these abstractions and all those sort of things with JavaScript, we're looking at a little bit more code. So our 28 lines of code now becomes 48. So as you can see, the concept becomes a whole lot more complicated. If we want to do inheritance, we have to extend all these different things. We have to include the code for handling how we're going to be extending, all this sort of stuff. So it really becomes a lot more complicated if we want to use that same concept ourselves. Granted, anytime you're dealing with a generator, the code can get a little more bloated. There's more optimal ways of doing the JavaScript, but this kind of gets you a concept. So definitely, I said, definitely worth taking some time looking at, playing around with different things. But what we're going to look at today is we're going to look at a project, and just to show you, this guy was recently generated using the SharePoint Framework Yeoman generator, so nothing tricky there. All I did is went through, selected, we're going to do one with no JavaScript framework, just to show you this is not anything React specific, because that gets a little more involved than having to teach you guys React is more than what we have time to deal with today. So we just used a basic template and created things out. I went in, made a few modifications to it. I've also included the patterns and practices JavaScript library for SharePoint. Awesome stuff. We'll look at that in a minute because it also is built with TypeScript, and so it makes life a lot easier. Now, if we switch over and look at our project, you're going to look and see nothing. If you've done any of the previous webinars, we're not at the moment, we don't have anything really all that different here, because this is, for the most part, straight out of the template. I've added in a few pieces, but it's there. Now, like I said earlier, we are already consuming and using TypeScript in our SharePoint Framework web parts without even really knowing it. So if we look at our web part file here, we have an extension on the end here that is a .ts. So our file itself here is a TypeScript file. And if we look at this, we can see we're exporting, because this will be compiled into a module, and we have a class. But it also extends from the base client-side web part. Inheritance, the beauty of TypeScript yet again. Also, we have an TypeScript demo web part props. So if we go, right-click on that and go to definition, oh, look, we have an interface. TypeScript yet again, and we have our typings are all here. So a lot of what we've dealt with, if you've seen anything in the SharePoint framework, TypeScript is an integral part of it. Now, there are some really cool things that TypeScript can do that you may not have noticed. So if we look at the template we've got here, we have some HTML markup included in here. But if you dealt with JavaScript for any length of time, you would know that this should not be working. JavaScript does not allow us to do multi-line strings. It's not an option. So how is this working? Well, in TypeScript, we can use the backtick. So if you look at your keyboard, if you're on an American keyboard, it's right next to your number 1. So if we start with a backtick and end with a backtick, TypeScript is going to treat that as a multi-line string, and we can also do some templating inside there, which is pretty cool. So if we look at it, we are already doing that. So to do the templating inside TypeScript, all we have to do is we do a $ curly brace, and then we end with a curly brace. With that, we can output anything we want into our string without having to do, okay, now I want to do a plus, close my quote, plus add in the variable, add another plus, start the rest of the string. It's all there. So for example, if I change this back to standard double quote and change that one, you'll notice the IDE, Visual Studio Code, is saying, hey, whoa, wait a minute here. I don't know what you're dealing with. This just looks really weird. So, okay, well, since we have some double quotes in our text, we'll do a single quote. Well, if we look at it, it's still complaining. And reality is I can do this plus this plus. This is how that we previously had to do multi-line text strings. Really not that easy to maintain, because if you want to come in and make a modification, you have to remember, okay, now did I put my plus on the end? I got to make sure I get my quote back at the beginning. So we'll just let TypeScript handle this one. Switch that back to our backtick. There we go. And life is good. So we have this stuff in here now. We also talked about we have protected options with our get properties. We have a lot of different things in here. Now, one of the other concepts that we didn't necessarily mention in the slides that you will most likely deal with and you'll see in a lot of code is there are different ways of defining a variable. So in TypeScript or in JavaScript as well, I can declare a variable and just say var, my var equals hello. Okay, and that works. And in TypeScript, since it is just JavaScript, that will continue to keep running. I can still interact with this, and so my JavaScript code will run. But now that we're in TypeScript, we have a few more options. So we can do the same thing, but instead of var, one of the options we've got is we can do a const, which really doesn't have a whole lot of significance other than we are telling TypeScript that I'm going to assign this variable, I'm going to give it a value, but I am never going to change it. So if I try and change it later in my code, we can see here, because we're in an editor that understands TypeScript, we get a message that says TS, so we know that's TypeScript error, cannot assign to my var because it is a constant or read-only property. Okay, cool. So it doesn't get us a whole lot, but it does add in some more syntactic validation saying, hey, I should never be modifying this value. If I am, I need you to complain and yell at me because it's not something I'm intending to do. Now, the other option we've got is we can create a variable and declare it with let. For anybody that's been working with JavaScript for many years, one of the issues you can run into is that TypeScript and JavaScript and TypeScript for that matter, if we're using var, the var, so any variable we create with a var, it gets created in the context, in the scope of the next function level above us. So right now, my var is declared, if I say it this way, in my function here. So, which is good for us. But the problem is, say for example, I am creating a for loop. Oops, wrong key there. I plus. So we have a fairly basic for loop. If I take this and I want to say, you know what? I want to create a variable. I only want this to exist inside my for loop. So I say, okay, I'll create a var. I'll call this my var2. And we'll say this is 1. We'll say I plus 2. So that way we're just using, so it has some benefit of our for loop. Now, normally you'd think, okay, in my code, I've declared this inside my for loop, so this should not exist anywhere else. Yet, with JavaScript, I can still access it. It is still defined. And just to show you, if I try doing my var3, which I have not defined yet, TypeScript is saying, hey, whoa, whoa, whoa. You have not defined this yet. Is this really what you wanted to do? And it says, hey, did you really mean to type my var3, or is that just a typo? And since the 3 isn't close to the R, did you really mean to type my var? So for example, if we're typing out some code, there were several times when I was working with JavaScript where I code something up, get everything I think working just fine, deploy it out there, test it in the browser, and it comes down to it crashes because I transposed a couple characters. It's like, dang, so I have to go through the whole deployment process all over again just to fix one single typo. Now, with TypeScript, we don't have to worry about that. But anyway, back to our problem here. So the var is getting created in the scope of our function. So our variable is hoisted, is the term you'll hear fairly frequently, all the way up to our function, which may or may not what you want to do. The fact that we're declaring it here inside of our value tells me that's probably not, inside of our for loop, that's probably not what we're wanting to do. So with TypeScript, we have a concept that we can do is we can use let. So let tells TypeScript, this guy really is only going to be included as far as my function. So in my current scope. So inside my curly braces is as far as this guy is going to exist. Anything beyond that, they're out of luck. It's not going to exist. And as you can see, TypeScript is already saying, hey, even though this line of code on 21 here was valid before, it is now no longer valid. And it says, hey, now this isn't what you want to be doing. I don't know what this is. Tell me what you really want to do with it. So that's kind of one of the cool things we can do with it. Now, also, we mentioned we have our my var, so we'll Oh, come on, editor, there we go. So we'll say, okay, yeah, I really am meant to do myvar. So if I change this, okay, well, myvar, I know it exists, it's right here. What's it complaining about? Well, it says type 1 is not assignable to type string. Granted, I haven't necessarily given it a type saying it is, but since I did it as the assignment, I assigned it directly, it says, okay, TypeScript says this is a string. So it's doing validation, says, yeah, you're assigning the wrong type here. So if I really want to say, okay, this is what I still want to deal with, I want a string representation in there, I just have to convert it over to string, and then life is good. Nothing super fancy there. No complaints. So the cool thing we've got is, if you're dealt with the SharePoint framework, we have a lot of cool things that we can do. But how do we go about figuring out what's available to us? Well, we can go dig out through a bunch of documentation. Okay, now what was the name of that value that I need to be dealing with and that class I need to interact with? So for example, if I want to deal and start issuing some REST calls out to SharePoint, well, I know there's this is referencing our class, okay. Also, I can come in and say, okay, this dot, boom. We have a list of everything that is defined and is included on there. So we know that we have a method on here that is get property pane configuration. So, okay, cool. And then if we look over here, we can see this particular method is not receiving any parameters. Okay, cool. We have some different options here. So if we have some events we're passing in, we can say, oh, okay, on after resize is saying, oh, what's our new width? So we know exactly what parameters we need to pass in. So just from having dealt with the SharePoint framework, I know that, okay, if we deal with our context dot sp HTTP client, okay, cool, that's what I want. Then I can do a dot get, then I know, okay, these are what I need to pass in. So if I'm doing a get request, I need to pass in a URL, so we know it's a string. I also need to pass in some configuration, but also I need, in that configuration, we can see what type of class it's expecting. There are also some options. And if you can see here, right next to right before our colon, there's a question mark. In TypeScript, that is how we define a parameter or a property, or if we're dealing with interfaces, those sort of things, that's how we define that is optional. They don't have to specify it. And as we can see here, there is not a default value being applied here. So if we don't specify something, it's just managing on the inside. So we can come in, issue our request, and life is good. We know what we're dealing with. We have all those people.
Ryan, it seems like we lost your sound a little bit, or at least I'm not hearing you. Yeah.
Yes.
Hey, Ryan, you're cutting in and out just a little bit. We're having a little trouble hearing you.
Okay, sorry about that. I was noticing the bar was going red a bit there, so.
Sorry about that.
All right, I'll have to see. Let me try and see if I can switch out my connection here real quick, just to make this a little more reliable.
Ah, yes, the magic of live webinars, everyone. Thanks for bearing with us for just a second while we get this going.
Gotta love it. Oh, and also check one thing. All right. Also, presenter foul helps us again. Get 1 second there.
Yeah, no worries, no worries.
All right, so let's see. Hopefully that should make a difference in our quality.
Hey, you sound great, man.
All right, I'm going to make sure I'm connected there. Let's drop off. Wow. Okay. Now I'm over a hardware connection. See if this makes us any better.
All right, you sound great, yeah.
Okay, so we're including our library here. It says we have no exported member. So I always forget, I have to kind of just, sometimes when you're doing an import, you have to do it a little differently, just based on how the library is configured. All right, so that being said, I can come in and say PNP dot sp dot web dot lists. As you can see, the flow and the fluidness that we're getting, because all this is because this is TypeScript. So we have our lists that I can say get by title. In our particular example, I know that I have a bands list in the site that I'm currently going to be loading this into. Life is good, then I can say dot get. Now, with TypeScript, we have some pretty cool things that we can deal with. So we can say, you know what, I'm going to be interacting with this. I can go out and call out to these services. Now, there are a couple different ways we can do this. So as part of our get, we're going to pass a go ahead, go get this. I can say dot then standard promises. Now, I can export this as a standard way I'm used to if I want to say function result. And we have everything that we need. Or if we want it, since this is just JavaScript, I can now also, let's do the TypeScript variation of that. I can take that out and I can give it a name. Call it return func, or we'll call it return f. Okay. But the easiest way that we can do, especially with TypeScript, is we have a new option where I can just say equals greater than. And this is telling TypeScript we're really doing a function, but we're going to kind of shorthand it a little bit, which really comes in handy when we're dealing with some different operations. So I can come in here now, like I said, this dot DOM element dot inner HTML equals, do our templating. We're going to say this, and then we'll say result sub 0 dot title. Oops, title. So one thing that TypeScript will not save us from is from typos from coming from external services, as we don't know what's actually there. So we'll put in title colon. And that's all we'd have to do. I can go out, run this guy, and life is good. Now, we can also do some type checking. We can create our own classes. So in this function, in this project, I've created a folder. I've called it model, server-side development habits, and I've called it band.ts. And really all this is just we're exporting a default class called band, and we're defining the properties that exist. So if we go out and look at the list that this is going to be driving against, it has these fields on it. So life is good. I also set up a static method for parsing. So if I want to include in, I can take any value that I'm getting back, and I can parse it over and create it, say this is a band object, and I have all the type safety and everything going along with it. Now, you'll also notice here, I have intentionally left this error in here. So we can say this is a function whose declared type is neither void nor any must return a value. So we have our line here on line 12, where we are supposed to be returning a band. I've commented this line out just to show you that this is what's going to happen if we don't. So, okay, all this is fine and good. We have everything in here, but how does this actually manifest when we're working with our project? So if we switch back out to our node command prompt, if I say gulp serve, this is going to go out and run the JavaScript transpilation. So up until this point, our code is still JavaScript. I mean TypeScript. It's stayed in TypeScript. Everything's there. When we run this, there are a bunch of tools that get run to handle the transpilation and the compilation, so everything works out nicely. So I'm going to run this, and this guy should complain due to our error that we've got there on our bands file, our band.ts file. Oh, and we see we have a nice big red message. So as you're working through these things, yeah, you can see it in your editor, but say, for example, you may not notice, it kind of gets lost in some other things, you're pasting in some code that a colleague sent you to try and fix one of your problems, you may not notice it. The tooling will give us the exact same error message. So we can know that's there. We can look and say, okay, well, this is telling me that in band.ts, I'm looking at about the second line, which makes very close sense, or it looks pretty close there if we can see from up here, and about character 26. So if we look there, yep, that's about where we are. So as soon as we take this out and save our file, we can run gulp serve again, and then this will run. Now, one of the things that's kind of done with this is we have a lot more involved with the whole process. So we have the transpilation. So we're transpiling our code. I'm sorry, I know I have the workbench under the window just to show you what it looks like over here. So we're transpiling our code. It's also packaging our code. So if we come in here, we have all of our stuff in here, we have our methods. If I want to break this again, say we've got our gulp serve running, since the SharePoint framework is watching all of our code changes, I'll just save this real quick and I'll switch back over. Okay, oh, we can also see it picked up the error again. So if you've already got something up in place, it's not going to crash the whole process. You may have to look and just make sure that everything transpiled fine. You didn't get any errors, which in our case we did, so we can just take it out. And we're back to running again. So we're good there. Now, as I mentioned, if we come in here, if I come in and I put in a debugger statement, which is a nice way of telling the browser, I want to stop here. So I'm going to take this URL, and in my window I've got here, I'm going to open up the workbench. Now, since I am loading this as part of the local workbench, this is going to complain. Looks like my script here is actually in a funky state. There it goes. Okay. It's because I highlighted some text there. All right. Yes, I want to proceed. So this is going to crash. Our web part is going to crash and burn when we add it to the page. So if I come in here, say TypeScript demo, okay. If we look at our developer tools, we have some nice nasty messages where it says, okay, _API. Well, this guy is really saying, is trying to communicate with SharePoint since said we're using the PNP, but it's not in SharePoint, so it's not going to work. But if we look at this, if I refresh, our debugger statement should hit since we have the guy open. And if you look at it, we are looking at, whoa, that went weird. Okay, we're not doing that anymore. This one? Nope, okay. That just does not, zooming is not going to work on this one. But if we look at up here, we have a .ts file, but the browser doesn't know what a .ts is. And like I said, we have the maps included, so we're stepping through and debugging with our own code. I can step, step, step. Everything works just fine. So life is good. Now, we can also say, for example, I want to take this. Let's load this into a full workbench so we can kind of see, make sure that our code actually works. So I have my tenant here, standard Office 365. This is actually just a developer tenant. If I go out to the workbench, should be nothing new if we dealt with the framework at all. Haha, this particular browser says I haven't talked to it yet. Oh, host 4321. All right, well, I'll go. I gotta make sure I get the right page. Oh, what are you doing back on that window? Oh, sure. Okay, haven't accepted the request because of the cert problems. Okay, now if we reload this, we should be good. All right, so we can come in here. Let's just open up our debugger tools. And we'll just attach this to the bottom here, just to keep them in line. All right, close that down. Now, if we go ahead and select our web part, we have our TypeScript demo. There we go. Okay. Yet we're still in the full thing. We have our options. I am also going to just put a breakpoint right here in my TypeScript code. And then when this function calls back, it should come in here, and lo and behold, we are here. So I can look, I have my result, and I've got a bit of a typo here. Actually, no, I am pulling back, I do have a typo. We told it we're pulling back bands. Well, problem is there is no result 0 bands with the title because we didn't tell it that we want the items. So we have a bit of issue there. TypeScript's not going to save you from all of your bugs and typos, but it'll catch most of them. So we now save that and come back to our browser, go to Workbench, and then everything will be happy. So we have our debugger statement because we left it in there, nothing funky there. Now we can see our result has a bunch of items in here, and there will be one item, and it has a title. So I can take this guy, and even though I'm copying this out of TypeScript, I can come over to the console, paste it, and we've got our information. Then if we continue, our web part should change. Now it says, oh, title Metallica, because that's what we told it to say. Now, one of the other cool things, I know we're running a little low on time, that I want to show you that's really a time saver for making our code easier to read. TypeScript also includes a concept of async and await. So if you've dealt with .NET, this is not a new concept. For asynchronous calls, we can specify and say, hey, you know what? I'm going to be dealing with some async calls, calling out to different services. So I can come on my method. In this method, I'm dealing with async. We'll change this up a little bit. We'll create another variable function. We'll call this a private function, get data. And this one we are going to, not date, we're going to mark as async. Sync, and we're going to create it. And we're just going to take our code out of there, paste it there. So we'll take our async off of here. Now, what the async and await allows us to do. So for example, instead of having to do a .then on all of this, what I can do let result equal await. And then with that, I no longer need all of this. My code now becomes a lot simpler, where it is result equals the await. Now the await says, okay, I'm expecting a promise, so I'm going to assume that what we're getting back is a promise. And so what I'm going to put into this variable you've given me is I'm going to put into there the response coming out of your then method. So as we had before, I'll do this part here, the parameter we're receiving from our service, it's going to assume that. So we can run that in here, call our class, our function, and as you'll notice, it's normally in JavaScript, this would work. I can call out and say, get data. Well, TypeScript, since we're doing this inside a class, it's a little more finicky when you say this dot get data. Then everything's good. So we have all those pieces in there. We can do some pretty cool stuff. And as you can see, it makes our code easier to maintain. If we're doing a lot of these things and makes it more reusable, we can work with all this stuff. So as you'll notice, since we've got everything in there, all of our errors are gone away. I don't know if you noticed before, but there was also one complaining about a SCSS file. That's because as part of the SCSS, it gets also transpiled to a .scs.ts file, which is how we get all of our classes here based off of those files. Once we compiled, that went away. But we have it, everything's good to go. We can play with it and carry on with our coding. So that being said, we will switch back over, just talk about a couple resources here. So as we mentioned before, most of these are going to be just basic TypeScript stuff, so you can go out and get it. Now the one key that is not TypeScript related coming directly from TypeScript is definitely typed. This is the GitHub repository out there where if you need for most of the commonly used libraries that may be out there, if you need the type definitions, they exist out there. So there's thousands of them that exist in this repository. So definitely worth taking a look at. And you have the links to the other places if you want to get more information. And that being said, we'll just turn it over and open it up to questions. Have my contact information there, and also if you have any questions, you can reach out to the excellent people at PixelMill or myself, and we could both be glad to help you out. So, Michael, do we have any questions at the moment?
All right. Thank you very much, Ryan. That was a great session. Great to hear about a lot of this stuff. It's been something I've been interested in learning about, so thank you. A good question I wanted to start with, actually, is what are some of the good, or not really what, where are some good resources to learn more about TypeScript? Like if they sat through this session and said, oh my gosh, this is great stuff, but I want to learn more, what are some good resources for them?
Yeah, the primary resource I'd say is definitely go take a look at TypeScriptLang.org, because that's the center of all knowledge for TypeScript. Also, I would suggest if you're curious, okay, some different things, how are people doing different pieces of functionality and how are they integrating it into their SharePoint Framework projects? The Office Dev PnP GitHub repository has hundreds of different samples using different concepts, and some of those are going to be TypeScript as well. So you can go out and look, say, okay, well, they're doing this really cool thing with this web part. Well, how are they doing that? And you can go look and see, okay, here's how they've got it structured. Here's how they've got things set up for working with TypeScript.
Cool, cool. Do you happen to have that URL by chance?
I had it up a bit ago. Let's see if my history remembers it. So it's going to be GitHub. Oops, if I can type. No, not mine. GitHub / it was just Office Dev PnP sample. So github.com/SharePoint/PnP. They have samples. So this has a lot of different things that are not necessarily SharePoint Framework related. I think they had a different repository. I think they had more SharePoint Framework. So let me see there. I think it was an Office PnP. So yeah, if we want to move on to the next question, I'll see if I can track it down real quick.
All righty. You kind of answered my second question as some of that. Okay. So is TypeScript only good for the framework, or can we use that for other projects as well?
You can use it anywhere you want. I've got some projects that have done inside the SharePoint framework and outside, in React, in JavaScript, in Angular. You can use TypeScript as long as, in any one of those, you just have to make sure that you just have the transpilation built in. So if you're using the modern setup with Node and all those sort of things, then you can deal with it. If you're not, you just have to make sure you transpile it first. But yeah, if you're doing those, it's fairly simple to include TypeScript and say, okay, I want to transpile this one as part of it. This guy's not it. Anyway, we may just have to include the link as a follow-on, because I know they've got hundreds of samples out there doing things with the SharePoint framework. So
absolutely, yeah, we can definitely include that.
I'm sure Eric's covered it before too, so nothing new there.
For sure. All right, another good question. Is there a good guidance on when best to use TypeScript, or like versus just using like vanilla JavaScript for a non-SharePoint framework project?
Personally, I try and make sure I use TypeScript in everything I can. If you're dealing with a project where you need to make sure you have a high certainty that you're producing really good, reliable code, I'd say it's a prime candidate. If you're producing something that is just a simple one-off, okay, I need to, on a SharePoint form, I need to change out some styling and things, TypeScript's going to be overkill. But if you're creating any sort of application, adding any sort of functionality, I would say it's a prime candidate for TypeScript.
Nice. Okay, great. So how do TypeScript and React relate to each other in the framework? Are they basically the same or something different?
TypeScript and React, TypeScript is just the language that we're using to write in, and React is the library that handles the rendering. So they're related, but not necessarily, because you can do React in straight JavaScript, and it doesn't care. because it just handles the rendering of our user interface. TypeScript is actually how we're creating the code that we're going to be interacting with. So it's kind of different pieces of it, but yeah, we're coding in TypeScript, and then React handles the UI is the simplest way of describing that.
Gotcha. Kind of a follow-up to that. Would someone need to learn both of them? Do they need to learn both of them, I guess, is a better way to say that?
Need? No. In your best interest? Yes. That's what I tell people a lot of times, because I've done some different sessions at different places about coding for SharePoint inside React, whether you're in Framework or not. And what I tell them is, a lot of times, and for us as a company, we just adopted React as our standard for development, and for several reasons, a couple of the biggest ones being, one, Microsoft has adopted React as what they're going to be primarily supporting. That is the big thing they're going to be working with. So a lot of the examples coming out of Microsoft themselves are going to be in React. So if you want to figure out how to do something, it's going to come out to React first, and then maybe the community will kind of to fill in the gaps later. If we're talking about also the Office UI fabric, Microsoft is producing reusable components so we can make our code and our projects look like they belong in SharePoint and not just okay, this is a bolt-on after the fact. We can make it look native as part of it. So I would definitely say React is definitely worth learning. And whether you decide that's what you want to go with, or maybe you prefer the ideals of the SharePoint of Angular or Vue.js, whatever framework you have out there, it's all kind of sixes. But our personal preference, we decided to stick with React because of the quickness of getting some of the samples and those sort of things out there from Microsoft.
All right. Well, there you go. Quick shout out to our friend. If I mispronounce your name, I'm so sorry. I believe it's Powell or Paul, one of the two. I'm so sorry. I'm the worst with names. Threw up the link for that we were looking for. It's github.com/SharePoint/sp-dev-fx-webparts/tree/master/samples. I will include that in our follow-up. I just wanted to say it out loud so somebody actually heard me say it. If you're able to follow along and actually get that written down, gold star to you, because I said that really quickly. So there you go.
So we have it as part of the recording in case anybody doesn't get those comments.
There you go.
Now on the screen.
There you go. Thank you, Ryan. That was probably a much better way to get that taken care of. Let me ask you, Ryan, what is your favorite part of TypeScript?
The thing I love about TypeScript is all the IntelliSense and editing and that's a bunch of things, because I came as a server developer, so a lot of C#, and I admit it, I started out as a VB.NET developer. I'm not ashamed to admit it. But so basically a lot of those server-side concepts, so with all the IntelliSense, the autocompletes, the code navigation, all these different things that server-side developers are just used to, we can now do again. So we get the full reliability and repeatability of our code, and it makes it so much easier just to maintain.
Absolutely. There you go. All right. Well, that is about the end of the questions that I had. Any further thoughts, Ryan, that you want to add to this?
No, just thank you, everybody, for listening to me ramble for the last hour. Hopefully you got something valuable out of it.
Definitely. Thank you all for joining us today. As you guys saw before, some of Ryan's contact info. Ryan, how can we find you? Website, Twitter stuff. Tell us a little bit about where we can find you.
Yeah, so put the slide back up. So we got Twitter, email, website, my blog's out there. I'll be speaking at a few different events. I'll be SharePoint Fest Chicago later this year, a few different SharePoint Saturdays over the next few months. So if you want to come see me in person, cool. If not, go ahead and reach out to me and shoot me a message, and love to chat and see what you're working on.
Great. Thank you very much. And if you guys are interested in talking to PixelMill a little bit more, you can find us on Twitter at PixelMillTeam. Check out our website, pixelmill.com. We'll also be around. We'll be in Chicago as well. We'll also be at Ignite, Microsoft Ignite in Orlando in September. So if you're around there, come say hi to us and whatnot. We're also going to have a special Live from Ignite webinar next month. So keep an eye out for the information on that. We just might have Ryan back. We do like him that much, so we might have him again. And that's it for now. Again, thank you everyone for joining us, and we will see you next time.
Thanks, everybody.